February 20th, 1945. Day 2 of the Battle of Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash and sand of the island stuck to everything. Uniforms, weapons, skin. The air smelled of sulfur and cordite, a hellish combination that Marines would remember for the rest of their lives. Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas crouched in a shallow trench with 3 other Marines from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division. At 17 years old, he was one of the youngest Marines on the island. But nobody there knew the full truth about Jack Lucas. They didn't know he had forged his mother's signature on enlistment papers when he was just 14 years old. They didn't know he had lied about his age, claiming to be 17 when he was barely a teenager. They didn't know he had gone absent without leave from his unit in Hawaii, stowing away on a Navy transport ship because he was desperate to see combat. And they certainly didn't know that in the next few seconds, this teenage boy would make a decision that defied every human instinct for survival. The morning had been chaos. Japanese forces hidden in the intricate network of tunnels and bunkers were launching fierce counterattacks. Machine gun fire cracked overhead. Mortar rounds shook the ground. The Marines were advancing yard by bloody yard across terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself. Lucas and his 3 companions, Privates First Class Donald Hollycross, Jimmy Craig, and Harold Bo Sewell, had taken temporary cover in a ravine carved into the volcanic rock. They were catching their breath, checking ammunition, trying to process the overwhelming violence surrounding them. Then it happened. 2 Japanese Type 97 hand grenades landed in the trench. The Type 97 was a devastating weapon. Unlike American grenades with a 4 to 5 second fuse, the Japanese grenade had a 7 to 8 second delay, just long enough to bounce into position before detonating. Each one contained enough explosive force to kill or severely wound everyone within a 10-meter radius. 2 grenades, 4 Marines, a space no larger than a household bathtub. The mathematics of death were simple and absolute. In approximately 7 seconds, all 4 young men would be dead or catastrophically wounded. There was no time to throw the grenades back, no time to run, no time to think. Jack Lucas was the closest to both grenades. What happened next would become one of the most documented and analyzed acts of heroism in military history. It would be studied at military academies, debated by medical professionals, and remembered by grateful Marines for generations. Lucas didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate odds or consider options. He simply acted. He threw his body over 1 grenade, then reached out and pulled the 2nd grenade underneath him as well. His last thought, as he would later recall, was remarkably simple. Well, this is it. The explosions were simultaneous and catastrophic. The force lifted Lucas's body off the ground. Over 200 pieces of shrapnel, jagged fragments of metal casing traveling at supersonic speeds, tore through his body. His ribcage absorbed multiple strikes. Shrapnel penetrated his chest, his arms, his legs, his face. 1 piece embedded itself less than an inch from his heart. Another lodged near his spine. The 3 other Marines were showered with debris and concussive force, but Lucas's body had absorbed the lethal shrapnel that would have killed them all. Private Donald Hollycross would later testify. 1 second Jack was there, next second there was this explosion, and he was just gone, thrown like a rag doll. We thought he was dead. We were sure he was dead. Nobody survives that. Nobody. But impossibly, incredibly, against every law of physics and medicine, Jack Lucas was still alive. Barely conscious, his body shredded by metal fragments. Bleeding from dozens of wounds, he somehow remained aware. His fellow Marines, themselves wounded by the blast, stared in disbelief. Corpsman! Someone screamed. Corpsman! Navy corpsman! Donald Schwartz reached Lucas within minutes. Though in combat, minutes feel like hours. What he saw defied his medical training. The young Marine's body was a catastrophic mess of wounds. Blood pooled beneath him, darkening the volcanic sand. His uniform was shredded. Shrapnel protruded from multiple entry points. By every indicator Schwartz had been trained to recognize, this Marine should have been dead before he arrived. But Lucas's eyes were open. He was trying to speak. "I'm okay," Lucas whispered through blood-flecked lips. "I'm okay. Get the others." Schwartz would later say it was the most absurd thing he'd ever heard from a wounded man. Lucas wasn't okay. He was as far from okay as a human being could be while still technically alive. But he was alive. The evacuation from the battlefield to the aid station, then to the hospital ship USS Samaritan, was a blur of morphine and chaos. Surgeons aboard the Samaritan worked for hours to stabilize Lucas, removing accessible shrapnel, repairing what damage they could. But over 200 pieces of metal remained embedded throughout his body. Some were too close to vital organs to risk removal. Others were too small to locate. Still others had fragmented further upon entry, creating a constellation of metal inside him. The head surgeon, Commander Harold Stoner, examined the X-rays with a mixture of professional fascination and genuine bewilderment. "This boy should be dead," Stoner told his staff. "By every metric we have, he'd have died in that trench. The fact that he survived the initial blast is miraculous. The fact that he's still alive now is beyond explanation." One of the assisting surgeons asked the question everyone was thinking. "How old is he?" When they checked Lucas's records, the truth emerged. He wasn't even 18 years old. He was 17, and the records showed irregularities in his enlistment papers. The full story would come out later. For now, the medical staff focused on the impossible task of keeping this teenager alive. But to understand how Jack Lucas ended up in that trench on Iwo Jima, we need to go back to where his story really began. To a small farm in North Carolina, where a boy who would become a legend was growing up in the shadow of a world at war. Jacqueline Harold Lucas was born on February 14, 1928, in Plymouth, North Carolina. Valentine's Day baby. The name Jacqueline, with its unusual spelling, would later prove useful when he needed to convince recruiters he was older than he appeared. His early years were marked by loss. His father, Jabez Lucas, died when Jack was just 6 years old, leaving his mother, Benny, to raise 5 children on her own during the depths of the Great Depression. North Carolina in the 1930s was hard country. Farm life meant endless work for meager returns. The Lucas family wasn't wealthy, but Benny Lucas made sure her children had what mattered: food on the table, clothes on their backs, and a strong sense of right and wrong. Jack was the middle child, and by all accounts, he was different from his siblings. Restless, energetic, prone to mischief. His older brothers later recalled that Jack could never sit still, never accept limitations, never back down from a challenge, even when common sense dictated he should. Jack was always trying to prove something, his brother William would later say. Even as a kid, he had to be tougher, faster, braver than everyone else. We thought he'd outgrow it. We were wrong. When Jack was 10 years old, the world changed forever. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. For most American children, Pearl Harbor was a distant shock, something adults discussed in worried tones over the radio. For Jack Lucas, it was a call to action. He devoured every newspaper article about the war. He listened to radio broadcasts with intense focus. He studied maps, learning the names of Pacific islands most adults had never heard of: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. He knew the names of ships, the types of aircraft, the strategies being employed. His family thought it was a phase. Lots of boys were fascinated by the war. They played soldier in the woods, pretended sticks were rifles, argued about who would be the Marines and who had to be the Japanese. But Jack wasn't playing. He was preparing. By age 12, Jack had made a decision that would have seemed absurd to anyone who knew about it. He was going to join the Marines. Not someday when he was old enough. Soon. As soon as possible. There was just one problem. The minimum enlistment age was 17, and even that required parental consent. To enlist at 17 without parental consent, a recruit had to wait until 18. Jack Lucas was 12 years old. He needed to age 6 years overnight. Most kids would have abandoned such an impossible plan. Jack Lucas began studying how to make it work. He paid attention to older boys in town, learning how they talked, how they carried themselves. He worked on his family's farm, building physical strength beyond his years. He shot rifles and shotguns, developing marksmanship skills. He read everything he could about the Marine Corps, their history, their standards, their training, and he learned about birth certificates and enlistment papers. In 1942, record-keeping wasn't what it would become in the digital age. Birth certificates were paper documents stored in county offices. Military recruiters relied on applicants to provide accurate information. There were no computer databases to cross-reference, no instant verification systems. If someone looked old enough and had paperwork that seemed legitimate, recruiters accepted it. Jack Lucas, watching older boys enlist and ship out, understood the vulnerability in the system. He just had to look the part and have the right papers. By early 1942, at age 14, Jack had physically developed beyond his years. Hard farm work had built real muscle. He was already 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 150 pounds, not unusual for a 17-year-old. His face, weathered by outdoor work, looked older than his actual age. He could pass for 17. He just needed the paperwork to match. The exact details of how Jack Lucas obtained falsified documents have never been fully disclosed, but the general outline is known. He acquired a birth certificate that listed his birth year as 1925 instead of 1928, making him 17 instead of 14. He forged his mother's signature on the parental consent form. He practiced writing in a more mature hand, and on August 6, 1942, Jack Lucas walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station in Norfolk, Virginia, and enlisted. The recruiter, Sergeant William Hutchins, looked over the paperwork. Birth certificate showing the applicant was 17. Parental consent form properly signed. The kid was big for his age, but some boys matured early. Nothing seemed unusual. "Son, do you understand what you're signing up for?" Hutchins asked. "Yes, sir," Jack replied. "I want to be a Marine." "The Marines are fighting in some of the worst conditions of this war," Hutchins continued. "Boot camp is 12 weeks of hell. Combat is worse. Are you sure about this?" Jack Lucas met his eyes without flinching. "I'm sure, sir." Hutchins nodded and processed the paperwork. "Welcome to the United States Marine Corps, Private Lucas." And just like that, at 14 years old, Jacqueline Lucas became one of the youngest Marines in American military history. If the recruiter had looked more carefully at the birth certificate, he might have noticed inconsistencies. If he had questioned Jack more thoroughly, the boy's knowledge gaps might have shown. If he had contacted Benny Lucas directly, the fraud would have been exposed immediately. But it was 1942. America needed Marines. The Corps was expanding rapidly to fight a two-ocean war. Recruiters were processing dozens of applicants daily. A big, healthy teenager with proper paperwork was exactly what they needed. Jack Lucas shipped out to Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island, South Carolina, for basic training on August 10, 1942. Paris Island was designed to break civilians and rebuild them as Marines. The training was physically brutal and psychologically demanding. Drill instructors were legendary for their ability to reduce grown men to tears. For 14-year-old Jack Lucas, it should have been impossible. He stood in formation with recruits who were 3, 4, 5 years older. He ran the same obstacle courses, did the same exercises, fired the same weapons, absorbed the same screaming abuse from drill instructors, and he thrived. Years of farm work had built legitimate physical strength. His obsessive preparation meant he knew Marine Corps knowledge that recruits typically had to learn from scratch. His youth, rather than being a disadvantage, gave him energy and recovery speed that older recruits lacked. Private Lucas finished boot camp in October 1942 without anyone suspecting his real age. He was assigned to follow-on training, then sent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, for further instruction. But here's where Jack Lucas's story takes its first dark turn. Because even though he had successfully infiltrated the Marine Corps, he was still just a kid. And kids make mistakes. At Camp Lejeune, Lucas's youth began showing in ways that had nothing to do with physical capability. He was impulsive. He had a temper. He got into fights with other Marines over trivial matters. He struggled with the tedious routine of garrison life. The same restless energy that drove him to enlist early made him ill-suited for the mundane daily grind of a peacetime base. His superiors noticed. Private Lucas was skilled, certainly, strong and capable, but also immature, hot-headed, prone to disciplinary problems. In early 1943, Lucas was assigned to the Marine Corps barracks at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a rear echelon posting, important for base security and training, but far from combat. For Jack Lucas, it might as well have been prison. He hadn't forged documents, lied about his age, and endured boot camp to stand guard duty in Hawaii. He had joined the Marines to fight. The war was raging across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Tarawa, and he was stuck thousands of miles from any action. His frustration grew with each passing month. He watched combat units rotate through Pearl Harbor, heading out to battle while he remained behind. He listened to Marines returning from the front lines, their stories both horrifying and compelling. Jack Lucas had joined the Marine Corps at 14 to fight for his country. Now 15, then 16, he was being told to wait. Be patient. Your turn will come. But Lucas had never been patient in his life, and he had no intention of starting now. By late 1944, as he approached his actual 17th birthday, Lucas had been in the Marine Corps for over 2 years without seeing combat. He had become a capable Marine, qualified with multiple weapons, trained in infantry tactics, physically fit, and mentally sharp. But he was also increasingly desperate. The Marines were preparing for major operations in the Pacific. Everyone knew something big was coming. The island-hopping campaign was approaching the Japanese home islands. The fighting would be brutal beyond anything yet seen in the war. Lucas wanted to be part of it. He needed to be part of it. The thought of sitting out the war in Hawaii was unbearable. So he started planning something that would make his initial enlistment fraud look cautious by comparison. Was going to go AWOL, absent without leave, not to avoid combat. Like most AWOL soldiers, but to get into it. In January 1945, Lucas learned that the 5th Marine Division was staging at Pearl Harbor for a major operation. The destination was classified, but rumors suggested it was one of the volcano islands, part of the final approach to Japan itself. This was it. This was his chance. Lucas began scouting the docks, watching as supplies and equipment were loaded onto Navy transport ships. He studied the security patterns, noting when guards changed shifts and where observation was weakest. He talked to Marines from the 5th Division, learning which units were loading when, which ships were carrying combat troops versus support personnel. And he made his decision. On January 7, 1945, as the USS Duel prepared to depart Pearl Harbor carrying elements of the 5th Marine Division, Private First Class Jack Lucas quietly slipped aboard. He didn't have orders. He wasn't on any manifest. He had no authorization to be on that ship. He was a 16-year-old Marine, going AWOL to sneak into one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The USS Duel was crowded with Marines and equipment. In the chaos of loading and departure, one extra body in dungarees wasn't immediately noticed. Lucas found a quiet corner in the troop berthing area and made himself inconspicuous. He stayed away from officers. He avoided anyone who might question why he wasn't with his assigned unit. He blended into groups of Marines from various companies, never staying in one place long enough to be questioned. For the first 2 days, it worked. Then, inevitably, someone noticed the Marine who wasn't on their roster. Questions were asked. Lucas's absence from his assigned unit in Hawaii was discovered. When Lucas was finally identified and brought before the ship's commanding officer, he expected to be thrown in the brig, returned to Pearl Harbor in chains, court-martialed, and possibly dishonorably discharged. Instead, something remarkable happened. The officer stared at this teenage Marine who had stowed away on a combat-bound ship and asked a simple question. "Private, what the hell were you thinking?" Lucas stood at attention. "Sir, I joined the Marines to fight. I've been in the Corps for 2.5 years. I'm trained. I'm ready. I didn't want to miss this operation, sir." The officer studied him for a long moment. By all rights, Lucas should have been severely punished. Going AWOL was a serious offense. Stowing away on a Navy vessel was worse. But this was January 1945. The Marine Corps was about to assault a heavily fortified island. They needed every trained rifleman they could get. "Private Lucas," the officer finally said, "you're an idiot. You're also apparently determined to get yourself killed. Against my better judgment, I'm going to let you stay with the division, but you will face charges when we return. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Lucas replied, trying not to smile. "Thank you, sir." He was assigned to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He would land with the assault waves. Jack Lucas had finally gotten what he wanted. He was going to combat. The target was Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a small volcanic island roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo. Only 8 square miles in total area. About half the size of Manhattan, it would become one of the most important pieces of real estate in the Pacific War. The island's Japanese name translates to Sulphur Island, a reference to the volcanic sulfur deposits that give parts of the island a distinctive yellow tint and fill the air with the smell of rotten eggs. In early 1945, Iwo Jima was strategically critical for both sides. For the Americans, the island would provide fighter airfields to escort B-29 bombers attacking the Japanese home islands, and emergency landing strips for damaged bombers that couldn't make it back to the Mariana Islands. Capturing Iwo Jima would save hundreds of American air crews. For the Japanese, losing Iwo Jima meant losing one of the last defensive barriers before the home islands. It would be a psychological blow and a tactical disaster. Both sides understood what was at stake. Both sides were prepared to fight to the death. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was one of the most capable officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. Unlike many Japanese commanders who favored suicidal banzai charges, Kuribayashi developed a sophisticated defensive strategy based on making the Americans pay in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. He had over 21,000 troops and nearly a year to prepare. What Kuribayashi created on Iwo Jima was a masterpiece of defensive engineering and a nightmare for attacking forces. The island was honeycombed, with tunnels connecting reinforced concrete bunkers and artillery positions. Some tunnel complexes went down 5 levels, complete with hospitals, command centers, and ammunition storage. The tunnels were designed so that if one position was destroyed, troops could retreat underground, move to another position, and resume fighting. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered on every beach and likely avenue of advance. Mortars were hidden in positions that made them nearly impossible to spot from the air or sea. Mount Suribachi, the 556-foot volcanic cone at the island's southern tip, was converted into a fortress with artillery positions, observation posts, and tunnels throughout its interior. The rest of the island, a barren landscape of volcanic ash, rocks, and scrub vegetation, offered almost no natural cover for attacking troops. Every fold in the terrain had been mapped and covered by Japanese weapons. Kuribayashi knew he couldn't win, but he could make victory cost the Americans so much that they might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. His strategy was simple: kill as many Americans as possible before being killed himself. The American invasion force was massive. Over 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, plus support elements. It was the largest Marine operation in the Pacific War. The pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16, 1945. For 3 days, Navy ships pounded the island with thousands of shells. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs. Rockets screamed into defensive positions. American commanders believed that nothing could survive such bombardment. They were wrong. Kuribayashi's fortifications were designed to withstand bombardment. His troops, hidden deep underground, waited for the shelling to stop and the Marines to land. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. Jack Lucas was not in the first wave. His unit, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, would land later in the day after the beachhead was secured. The teenager who had lied his way into the Marines, who had gone AWOL to get into combat, was finally about to experience war. The transport ship carrying Lucas's unit circled offshore as the first waves landed. From the deck, Lucas could see Mount Suribachi dominating the southern end of the island. He could see the beaches packed with landing craft, tanks, and Marines. And he could see the explosions as Japanese artillery began firing. The first waves had landed unopposed, exactly as Kuribayashi planned. He wanted the beaches packed with Marines and equipment before opening fire. When the trap was sprung, it was devastating. Artillery shells crashed into the beaches. Mortar rounds dropped from the sky. Machine gun fire swept across the volcanic sand. Marines trying to advance inland found that the volcanic ash, fine and loose, made movement exhausting. Men sank up to their ankles with each step. Equipment bogged down. Vehicles struggled for traction. And all the while, Japanese weapons fired from positions that seemed impossible to locate. By the time Charlie Company landed that afternoon, the beaches were a chaotic nightmare of destroyed equipment, wounded men, and Marines trying desperately to push inland. Lucas stepped off the landing craft into ankle-deep volcanic ash. The smell hit him immediately. Sulfur, smoke, cordite, and something else he couldn't identify but would later recognize as death. The sound was overwhelming. Artillery explosions, machine gun fire, officers shouting orders, wounded men crying for corpsmen. It was chaos in its purest form. This was nothing like training, nothing like the stories he'd heard. This was industrial-scale violence conducted on a small island with nowhere to hide. For just a moment, the 17-year-old Marine from North Carolina might have wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then his training kicked in. He followed his unit inland, away from the beach, toward the sound of fighting. The first day of the Battle of Iwo Jima cost the Marines over 2,400 casualties, killed and wounded. It was one of the bloodiest days in Marine Corps history, and it was just the beginning. The battle plan called for a rapid advance across the island, but Kuribayashi's defensive strategy shattered that plan within hours. The Marines were forced into slow, brutal, close quarters fighting for every bunker, every tunnel, every yard of ground. Flamethrowers became the primary weapon for bunker clearing. Engineers used demolition charges to seal tunnel entrances. Tanks fired point-blank into firing ports. And infantrymen like Jack Lucas advanced yard by yard through a landscape that seemed designed for maximum lethality. The terrain itself was treacherous. The volcanic ash made digging foxholes difficult. The loose material kept collapsing. The rocks were sharp and jagged. There were no trees for cover, no buildings to shelter in, no natural protection. And everywhere, hidden in that volcanic rock, Japanese defenders waited with machine guns, rifles, and grenades. Lucas learned quickly. He learned to identify the sound of different weapons. He learned to move from cover to cover without exposing himself unnecessarily. He learned to watch for the nearly invisible firing, ports that marked bunker positions. He learned that war was nothing like he'd imagined, the teenage bravado that drove him to forge enlistment, papers, and stow away on a transport ship encountered the reality of modern combat. Men died suddenly, violently, randomly. A Marine could be talking one moment and dead the next, killed by a sniper round or mortar fragment. The Japanese defenders fought with a determination that bordered on suicidal. They almost never surrendered. When positions became untenable, they fought until killed or withdrew through tunnels to another position. On February 20th, the second day of the battle, Lucas and his squad were ordered to advance toward a Japanese defensive line northeast of the beaches. The terrain was a nightmare. Volcanic rock, steep ravines, and limited visibility. They moved slowly, checking every depression and rock formation for hidden defenders. The smell of sulfur mixed with smoke created a thick, choking atmosphere. Around mid-morning, Lucas's squad encountered heavy resistance from a fortified position. Machine gun fire forced them to take cover in a series of natural ravines and depressions in the volcanic rock. This was where Jack Lucas and 3 other Marines, Privates First Class Donald Hollycross, Jimmy Craig, and Harold Bowe Sewell ended up in the shallow trench that would define the rest of Lucas's life. They were catching their breath, checking their ammunition, trying to figure out how to advance past the machine gun position that had them pinned down. None of them saw the Japanese soldier, who popped up from a concealed position and threw 2 grenades into their trench. The EU Type 97 hand grenades bounced once on the volcanic rock and rolled to a stop among the 4 Marines. For a fraction of a second, all 4 men stared at the grenades. 7 seconds, maybe 8, that's all the time they had. In that instant, Jack Lucas made the decision that would define him forever. He didn't think about the future. He didn't consider the consequences. He didn't calculate odds. He simply acted. Lucas threw himself forward, covering 1 grenade with his body. As he fell, he reached out with his right arm and pulled the second grenade underneath him as well. His 3 fellow Marines, frozen in shock, had just enough time to register what Lucas was doing before the grenades exploded. The detonation was massive in the confined space of the trench. Lucas's body absorbed the primary blast force and most of the shrapnel from both grenades. Over 200 metal fragments, each traveling at supersonic velocity, tore through his body. The explosion literally lifted him off the ground and threw him against the side of the trench. Hollycross, Craig, and Sewell were hit by secondary shrapnel and blast effects. All 3 were wounded, but none critically. Lucas's body had absorbed what would have killed them all. For several seconds, no one moved. The Marines' ears were ringing from the blast. Dust and smoke filled the trench. Then Hollycross, shaking off the shock, crawled toward Lucas's motionless body. "Jack!" he screamed. "Corpsman! We need a corpsman!" Lucas was lying on his back, his uniform shredded, blood spreading across the volcanic ash beneath him. His eyes were closed. He wasn't moving. Hollycross was certain he was dead. No one could survive 2 grenade blasts at point-blank range. But as he reached Lucas, he saw something impossible. Jack Lucas's eyes opened. His lips moved, trying to form words. Hollycross leaned closer, unable to believe what he was seeing. "I'm okay," Lucas whispered. "Get the others." It was the most absurd thing Hollycross had ever heard. Lucas was as far from okay as a human being could be while still technically alive. But he was alive. Navy Corpsman Donald Schwartz reached the trench within minutes, guided by Hollycross's frantic calls. What he found challenged everything he knew about human physiology and combat medicine. Lucas had sustained catastrophic injuries. Shrapnel had penetrated his chest, arms, legs, and face. His uniform was soaked with blood. Multiple wounds were bleeding actively. The volcanic ash beneath him was dark red. Schwartz's training told him this Marine should be dead. The severity and number of wounds, the blood loss, the shock, any one of several injuries should have been fatal. But Lucas's pulse was present, weak and rapid, but present. He was breathing, shallow, labored, but breathing. Schwartz began emergency treatment, applying pressure dressings to the worst bleeding, administering morphine, calling for an evacuation. The process of getting Lucas from the front lines to the aid station was agonizing. Every movement caused additional bleeding. The rough terrain made carrying a stretcher extremely difficult, but somehow, impossibly, Lucas remained alive throughout the evacuation. At the battalion aid station, doctors performed a quick assessment before sending Lucas to the beach for evacuation to a hospital ship. Their assessment was grim. Multiple penetrating wounds, severe hemorrhage, shock. Prognosis: poor. Translation: he's probably going to die. Lucas was evacuated to the USS Samaritan, a hospital ship offshore. The ship's surgical team, accustomed to treating severe combat wounds, was stunned by what they saw. The X-rays revealed a constellation of metal fragments throughout Lucas's body. Over 200 distinct pieces of shrapnel, some tiny fragments, others substantial chunks of grenade casing. Commander Harold Stoner, the chief surgeon, gathered his team around the X-rays. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this Marine shouldn't be here. By every medical principle we know, He should have died in the field. The fact that he's alive is extraordinary. The fact that he's stable enough for surgery is impossible. One of the assisting surgeons asked, "Can we save him?" Stoner studied the x-rays again. "I don't know, but we're going to try." The surgery lasted hours. The team removed accessible shrapnel, repaired damaged blood vessels, treated wounded organs, but over half the metal fragments remained. Too deep, too close to vital structures, too risky to remove. Some pieces were embedded in or near his heart. Others were lodged against his spine. Still others had fragmented into dozens of smaller pieces impossible to extract individually. These fragments would remain in Lucas's body for the rest of his life. When the surgery ended, Stoner addressed his team. "What we witnessed today is medically unprecedented. This boy absorbed the full force of 2 grenade explosions and survived. I've been a surgeon for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Lucas remained in critical condition for days. Infection was a constant threat. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima was contaminated with bacteria, and many of his wounds had been packed with the stuff. But slowly, impossibly, he began to recover. His fellow Marines from Charlie Company, meanwhile, had submitted witness statements about what they'd seen in that trench. The statements were forwarded up the chain of command. Within days, senior officers were reviewing the incident. The testimonies were consistent and compelling. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas had deliberately thrown himself on 2 grenades to save his fellow Marines. It was the highest form of heroism, willing, self-sacrifice for others. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was immediate and unanimous, but there was a complication. When military investigators began processing the paperwork, they discovered irregularities in Lucas's service record. The dates didn't match. His age at enlistment seemed questionable. His unauthorized presence on the USS Duel raised red flags. A thorough investigation revealed the truth. Jacqueline Lucas had enlisted at age 14 using forged documents. He was currently 17 years old, not 19 as his records indicated. He had gone AWOL from his assigned unit to join the Iwo Jima operation. The Marine Corps faced an unprecedented situation. They had a Marine who had clearly earned the nation's highest military honor through extraordinary heroism. But that same Marine had violated multiple regulations, committed fraud, and gone AWOL. What do you do with a hero who's also technically a criminal? The decision went all the way up the chain of command. Eventually, senior leadership made a practical choice. The heroism outweighed the infractions. Lucas would receive the Medal of Honor. The other issues would be addressed separately. On October 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas. Lucas, still recovering from his wounds and barely 17 years old, became the youngest Marine to receive the Medal of Honor since the Civil War, and the youngest service member to receive it during World War II.